Check-in officer calls airport security on black woman over suspicious bag. What they find inside leaves everyone stunned. The airport buzzed with the usual sounds, rolling suitcases, the hum of distant conversations, and flight announcements echoing from the speakers. Among the crowd, a woman walked in with calm, steady steps. Her name was Ms. Jordan, and she didn't look like she was in a rush. But somehow, she moved with purpose. She wore a plain gray hoodie with the hood slightly raised, dark jeans, and large black sunglasses that hid her eyes. Her suitcase, a medium-sized black bag, rolled smoothly behind her. It didn't make a sound, unlike the clattering suitcases other travelers were dragging. Wait, before you go any further, if this story has you hooked, smash that like button and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss what happens next. Click the notification bell so you're the first to see how this suspenseful story ends. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. We want to hear from you. Stay tuned, it's about to get wild. Her eyes moved slowly, scanning the crowd like she was looking for something, or maybe someone. Her head shifted left, then right, but her pace didn't change. It was the kind of focus that made her seem alert but not anxious. People passed her without a second glance, but if you looked closely, you'd see something different about her. She wasn't just another traveler. As she reached down to adjust her jacket, something shiny caught the light for a split second. The metallic badge clip on her hip glimmered before being covered by her jacket again. It happened so fast that no one noticed, not even the passengers near her, but it was there. If you were paying attention, you would have seen it. She approached the check-in counter, where Mr. Reynolds sat slouched in his chair. His eyes looked half-closed, his shirt was wrinkled, and his expression screamed, "I'm ready to go home." He tapped his fingers on the counter, clearly having a rough day. When Ms. Jordan placed her passport and boarding pass on the counter, Mr. Reynolds glanced up. At first, his eyes didn't show much interest, but then he noticed her calm, steady gaze. Something about her made him sit up straighter. His eyes moved from her face to her hoodie, down to her suitcase. His brows furrowed. "Where you headed, ma'am?" he asked, his voice bored but slightly suspicious. "Just catching a flight home," Ms. Jordan said, her voice calm and steady. She didn't offer any extra details. "What's in the bag?" Mr. Reynolds asked, tilting his head like he was looking for signs of nervousness. His eyes locked on the suitcase. "Just clothes and personal items," she replied simply. She didn't fidget, didn't look away. Her hands rested casually by her sides. But Mr. Reynolds didn't believe her. He tilted his head to the side, his eyes narrowing like he was a detective solving a mystery. He leaned forward to inspect the suitcase. "That bag's kinda heavy for just clothes, ain't it?" he muttered, his eyes still locked on the suitcase. He reached out and tilted the suitcase slightly. It didn't wobble like a bag full of clothes would. His eyes moved to the tag on the bag. No full name, just 2 letters. Jur. No name on it. He muttered under his breath, squinting harder like that would make the letters spell out more. His face twisted into a look of suspicion. "I don't like this," he mumbled as he pressed the intercom button on the side of his desk. His eyes flicked toward Ms. Jordan like he was watching a criminal. "I need security at checkpoint B, possible issue with a bag," he said quietly into the intercom. His eyes stayed on her the whole time, watching for any sign of nervousness. But Ms. Jordan didn't flinch. She tilted her head slightly, raised an eyebrow, and gave him a look that said, "Really?" Her face stayed calm, too calm, and that made Mr. Reynolds even more suspicious. The sound of heavy boots thudding against the floor echoed from the distance. The crowd at the airport slowly began to notice. People moved aside as 2 large officers approached, their eyes scanning the area like lions on a hunt. Officer Blake and Officer Sandals weren't the kind of men you ignored. They were tall, broad, and looked like they hadn't smiled in years. They wore black uniforms with silver badges that glinted under the airport lights. Their eyes darted toward the counter. "What's the problem?" Officer Blake asked, his deep voice cutting through the background noise like a knife. Mr. Reynolds jerked his thumb toward Ms. Jordan. "This lady's bag looks heavy," he said, crossing his arms and nodding toward the suitcase. "No name tag, just initials. And she's too calm for someone about to board a flight." Officer Blake turned his head toward Ms. Jordan. His eyes scanned her from top to bottom. He locked eyes with her, his face cold as stone. She didn't move. She didn't blink. She just stood there, still as a statue. "Ma'am," Officer Blake said, his eyes sharp like a hawk. "We'll need to check that bag. Step this way, please." For a moment, there was complete silence. Travelers around them stopped walking. People turned their heads, their eyes glued to the scene. Phones were pulled out. Cameras started recording. Whispers began to ripple through the crowd like waves on a shore. "What's going on? Is she getting arrested? Yo, I'm recording this." Ms. Jordan didn't say a word. She sighed, tilting her head slightly like she was tired of the situation. Her gaze shifted from Officer Blake to Officer Samuels. Then she looked back at Mr. Reynolds, who stood at the counter with his arms crossed like he'd already won a game. "Are you sure you want to do this?" she asked softly, her voice smooth but sharp like the edge of a blade. Her words hung in the air. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a plea. It was a question, but one that didn't sound like she was looking for an answer. The officers looked at each other. Officer Blake frowned. "Yes, Mom. Let's go." Ms. Jordan calmly grabbed the handle of her suitcase and pulled it behind her. Her movements were slow, smooth, controlled. She didn't rush. She didn't panic. The officers followed closely behind her, their boots thudding like a countdown. The travelers watching the scene whispered to each other. "She's too calm. That's weird. They're about to find something, I bet. I'm recording it. This is about to get good." As Ms. Jordan walked toward the small security room, her head remained high, her steps slow but steady. She didn't look back. The crowd didn't look away. The whispers grew louder. The phones kept recording, and everyone was waiting for what would happen next. The cold, gray walls of the small security room seemed to close in as the door swung shut behind them with a loud clunk. The sound echoed, making the silence in the room feel even heavier. There was nothing on the walls. No posters, no signs, no clocks. Just cold, flat gray. A single small window sat at the top of the back wall, too high for anyone to see out of it. In the middle of the room, there was a large metal table, cold and shiny, like something you'd see in a detective movie. Ms. Jordan stepped in first, still pulling her suitcase behind her. Her walk didn't change. She didn't look left or right. She walked straight to the table, cool as ever. Her face was unreadable, calm like she had seen this kind of thing 100 times before. Behind her, Officer Blake and Officer Samuels followed closely. Their boots thudded heavily on the tile floor. Officer Samuels took his spot by the door, crossing his arms and leaning against the wall like he was guarding the exit. His eyes never left Ms. Jordan. Officer Blake stayed closer, standing on the opposite side of the metal table. He didn't blink. His eyes stayed on her face, watching her like she was about to make a move. "Place your bag on the table," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it had that sharp, commanding tone that made people listen. For a second, Ms. Jordan just stood there. Her eyes shifted to him slowly. Then, with the same calm, steady pace, she reached down, gripped the handle of her suitcase, and lifted it onto the table. The sound echoed in the empty room. Her hand stayed on the suitcase for a second longer than needed. Then she let go, stepping back just a little. Her eyes didn't move from Officer Blake. She didn't say a word. The camera zooms in on her face. Her expression didn't change. She blinked slowly, took a deep breath, and folded her arms, leaning back slightly, as if she was about to watch a movie. The sharp sound of rubber gloves being pulled on echoed like a firecracker. It was loud in the small, silent room. Officer Blake snapped on his second glove with a quick, sharp movement. His eyes flicked to Ms. Jordan, but she didn't react. Not even a flinch. He frowned. He reached for the zipper of the suitcase. His fingers gripped it tightly, moving slowly, like he was about to open something dangerous. The sound of the zipper echoed. It wasn't fast. It wasn't rushed. It was painfully slow, dragging on like it was meant to build tension. Officer Blake kept his eyes on the suitcase, but Officer Samuels was watching Ms. Jordan. He expected her to look nervous, to shift her weight, or glance at the door, but she didn't. The camera cuts to the faces of the officers. Blake's eyes were locked on the bag, his lips pressed together, his jaw tight. Samuels squinted, his arms still crossed. His eyes darted from the bag to Jordan, watching both at once. The zipper finally reached the end. Click. For a moment, none of them moved. Nobody spoke. It was like everyone was waiting for the bag to open itself. Then, with a flick of his wrist, Officer Blake flipped open the top of the suitcase. For a moment, it was hard to understand what they were looking at. The officers stared at the contents of the bag, their eyes narrowing in confusion. Their eyes darted from one object to the next, trying to make sense of it. Inside the suitcase were metal objects, wires, and strange-looking devices. Not clothes, not shoes, not personal items. Just gadgets, metal plates, blinking lights, and small circuits. Some of the objects were smooth and silver, while others were dark black with small lights flickering on them. Wires crisscrossed everything, tangled but neat, like they were part of a larger machine. "What the heck is this?" Officer Samuels said, pushing off the wall and walking toward the table. His eyes widened as he leaned in for a closer look. He looked over at Officer Blake. "You seeing this?" Before anyone could answer, a loud voice echoed from outside the small window. I knew it. It was Mr. Reynolds. He was standing at the window with his hands pressed against the glass, grinning like a kid who just won a game. I told Al she was up to something. Look at all that. I knew it. His grin was wide, proud, like he had just been crowned the smartest man in the airport. I knew something was off. Look at that bag. I was right. But inside the room, the energy was different. It wasn't excitement. It was fear. Officer Blake's jaw tightened. He glanced at Officer Samuels, then back at the contents of the bag. He reached inside slowly, his fingers careful and precise. He pulled out one of the metal objects, a smooth silver device with a blinking green light. He turned it in his hand, examining it like it was a puzzle piece. "This ain't right," he muttered, his voice low and tense. "This ain't normal." He looked back at Officer Samuels, his eyes filled with something close to worry. "You ever seen anything like this before?" Samuels shook his head. "Not once." Blake carefully placed the object on the table, his eyes flicking to the tangled wires still inside the suitcase. His breathing got slower, heavier. He knew something was off. "We may have a situation here," Blake muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. His hand moved toward his radio. His fingers hovered over the call button. Ms. Jordan finally spoke. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," she said softly, tilting her head slightly to the side. Her voice was calm, just like it had been at the check-in counter. No fear, no rush, just calm. Both officers froze. Their eyes snapped to her face. "Excuse me?" Officer Blake asked, his brows furrowed. His finger hovered over his radio like he was about to press it. Jordan leaned forward, her arms still crossed. "If you press that button, you're gonna bring in people who aren't ready to handle what's in that bag." Her voice was so calm, it almost sounded like a warning. Officer Samuels glanced at Blake. "She's bluffing," he said, shaking his head. "She's trying to stall." But Officer Blake didn't move. He was looking at her face. She wasn't stalling. She wasn't bluffing. She was serious. "What's in the bag, Jordan?" Blake asked, his tone different this time. Less confident, more cautious. Jordan tilted her head the other way, almost like she was disappointed. "You tell me, officer," she said, her eyes locked on his. "Since you know so much." For the first time since the search began, Blake felt doubt. Officer Blake reached into the suitcase again, his fingers brushing past the wires and metal devices. His brow furrowed as he felt something cold, smooth, and solid. It didn't feel like the other objects. It was smaller, more compact. Slowly, he pulled it out. It was a small silver case about the size of a wallet. His eyes squinted as he examined it. There was a small button on the side. Without thinking, he pressed it. Pop. The case flipped open. Silence. Time seemed to slow as his eyes dropped to the inside of the case. Sitting on a soft black cushion, perfectly centered, was a shiny metallic badge. It wasn't just any badge. This one had 3 bold letters that seemed to glow in the dim light. CIA. If this story has you hooked, smash that like button and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss what happens next. Click the notification bell so you're the first to see how this suspenseful story ends. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. We want to hear from you. Officer Blake froze. His eyes widened like he'd seen a ghost. The color drained from his face. For a second, it looked like he forgot how to breathe. His hands tightened on the small silver case, but he didn't move. He glanced at Officer Samuels, his face pale as snow. She's CIA, he muttered, his voice shaky, barely louder than a whisper. His words sounded like he was trying to convince himself it wasn't real. Samuels blinked twice. What? No. He stumbled backward, bumping into the wall, eyes darting between the badge and Ms. Jordan. Are you serious? His voice had a hint of panic. The camera cuts to Ms. Jordan's face. She's calm. Too calm. She's not shocked. She's not scared. She knew this moment was coming. Her eyes are steady, her lips pressed into a slight, knowing smile. She tilts her head just a little, watching the officers the same way a lion watches prey. All of a sudden, the room feels different. Just moments ago, Officer Blake and Officer Samuels had full control. They were in charge. They called the shots. But now, everything had flipped. Officer Blake swallowed hard. Slowly, like he was carrying something fragile, he turned to face Ms. Jordan. His eyes were no longer cold or sharp. They were full of doubt. Why didn't you tell us? He asked, his voice soft, almost like a child asking a parent for forgiveness. Ms. Jordan raised an eyebrow, letting a small smirk creep onto her face. Why should I have to? She asked, her voice cool and sharp like glass. You already made up your mind about me, didn't you? Her words sliced through the room like a blade. Blake's face twisted with guilt. His eyes dropped to the floor. He knew she was right. Officer Samuel stood still, leaning on the wall like he had just run a marathon. We didn't know, he stammered, his voice cracking. Of course you didn't, Ms. Jordan said, folding her arms. Her gaze shifted to Samuel's. That's the problem. The silence in the room was so heavy you could hear every breath, every shuffle of their boots. Without a word, Ms. Jordan turned toward the door. Her movements were slow and controlled, not rushed, not afraid. She grabbed the handle of her suitcase, pulled it off the table, and rolled it behind her. The soft rattle of the suitcase wheels was the only sound in the room. The officers didn't move. They didn't stop her. They didn't say a word. At the window, the crowd of passengers was still watching. Phones were still up, recording every moment. Their faces were filled with shock and confusion. Wait, she's CIA. One person whispered. No way? Ms. Jordan reached the door but didn't open it. Instead, she glanced back at Officer Samuels. Are you just gonna stand there, or are you gonna open the door? She said, her voice laced with quiet authority. Her eyes locked on him. Samuel's eyes went wide. Yes, Mom. Right away, Ma'am. He jumped into action, unlocking the door like his life depended on it. His hands moved so fast, it was almost funny. He swung the door open and stepped aside, head down like a student in trouble. As Ms. Jordan walked past them, she didn't say a word, but just as she reached the doorway, she paused. She tilted her head to look back, her eyes locking on Mr. Reynolds, who was still standing behind the window, his jaw hanging open like he'd just seen a UFO. "Next time, ask before you assume," she said without breaking her stride. Her voice was calm but sharp. Reynolds didn't answer. He didn't even move. His face burned red with embarrassment as he realized that every passenger behind him was still recording. The moment Ms. Jordan stepped through the doorway, the airport erupted in a mix of cheers, gasps, and excited chatter. People who had been quietly watching from behind their phones now clapped loudly. Some even whistled. "She's CIA." "No way," shouted a teenage boy near the front of the crowd, his phone still raised, capturing every second. Another man held his phone up higher, grinning from ear to ear. "I got it all on video," he bragged, his voice carrying over the noise. "They're gonna go viral for this one." Passengers clapped as Ms. Jordan walked past them, her suitcase rolling softly behind her. Her walk didn't change. Her head was high, her face calm, and her step steady. She didn't rush. She didn't need to. Every eye in the airport was on her, but she acted like it didn't matter. "That's real power right there," said one woman, nudging her friend. But not everyone shared in the celebration. Mr. Reynolds stood frozen behind the check-in counter, his eyes wide, his mouth slightly open like he had forgotten how to close it. His face had gone from pink to bright red as he realized the crowd wasn't just watching Ms. Jordan. They were watching him too. He glanced up. Cameras were pointed at him. People were still recording, their faces filled with smug satisfaction. One woman shook her head, holding her phone steady. "See, that's why you don't judge people," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You never know who you're dealing with." Another person laughed, nudging their friend. "Bet he's rethinking his whole life right now." Reynolds blinked quickly, his eyes darting to every camera lens in front of him. His heart pounded in his chest. He rubbed the back of his neck, looking down at his desk like he was searching for something to do. But there was nothing to do. Everyone had seen it. They'd seen him doubt her, question her, treat her like a suspect, only to find out she was CIA. Meanwhile, Ms. Jordan kept walking. Her eyes were fixed ahead. She didn't look at the crowd, didn't wave, didn't acknowledge anyone. Her fingers tapped lightly on the handle of her suitcase. Then her phone buzzed in her pocket. She stopped walking, pulled it out, and glanced at the screen. The message was simple, but it made her smile. Mission complete. She tapped a quick response. They failed. Her fingers moved with precision, no hesitation. She hit send. As she slipped the phone back into her pocket, she paused for a moment. Her eyes lifted, gazing at something far off in the distance. Her face softened, then shifted into a slow, confident smirk. Her head tilted slightly to the side, as if she was thinking, "I told you so." Wait, before you go, if this story had you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button and subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. Click the notification bell so you never miss a twist or a powerful moment like this again. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. Stay tuned. More jaw-dropping stories are on the way.